10 fascinating unsolved mysteries from Scotland. There's no denying Scotland's rugged beauty and mystical Celtic charm. There's also a lot about the place that's baffling to outsiders. What do men wear under their kilts? Who thought bagpipes were a good idea? Do I even want to know what's in this haggis? These 10 mysteries are even weirder, and even the natives haven't been able to figure them out.
1. The death of Annie Borgesson. On December 4, 2005, the body of Annie Borgesson, a 30-year-old Swedish woman, was discovered on the shore of Prestwick, on the west coast of Scotland. Police quickly ruled it a suicide by drowning, but Annie's family wasn't convinced, and they uncovered some odd things when they looked into it. When Annie's body arrived back in Sweden, the undertakers there claimed she had several bruises that she seemed to have incurred while she was still alive. The autopsy in Scotland hadn't recorded these bruises. There were other marks on her body, too, which official reports had concluded to be the result of collisions with debris in the sea. What most concerned the family, though, were the unanswered questions about Annie's last day. Annie lived in Edinburgh, but on December 3rd, she travelled 129 kilometres, 80 miles, to Prestwick Airport for unknown reasons. She tried to withdraw cash using her credit card twice, first £100, and then £50. Both times, she didn't have enough funds in her account to complete the transaction. She proceeded to the airport, where her image was captured on video surveillance in the late afternoon. Timestamps from the airport's security footage show that she moved the length of the terminal in 55 seconds. Independent investigators determined that this should take over a minute and a half at normal walking speed and concluded that she must have been running. In total, she spent less than 5 minutes at the airport. According to a friend who had seen the footage, she appeared to be walking around looking annoyed and angry. She then began walking toward Prestwick itself. She wasn't familiar with the town, which was about a mile away from the airport. A witness later claimed to have seen a figure standing on the beach near the sea, but the figure was too far away to identify. When Annie's family began their investigation, they hit a wall of secrecy. Scottish authorities refused to release tissue samples that could help clarify the cause of death. When the family accessed Annie's email account, they found that all of her emails had been deleted. A friend named Maria Jansen discovered that Annie's phone company had failed to register any of the calls she had made to Annie during 2005, and the phone company refused to discuss it with her. Maria began to frequently receive silent phone calls. Family members had problems with their email accounts. Police claimed that there were no records of any calls to or from Annie during her last 3 days, even though several people remembered talking to her. It later came to light that Annie's hair had been cut after her death and thrown away. Annie's family continues to campaign for a full investigation. Her mother has met with the First Minister of Scotland, and a petition of 3,000 signatures was presented to the Scottish Parliament at the end of 2013. The family wants the police to investigate the possibility that Annie was killed during the missing 16 hours between the time she left the airport and when her body was found.
2. Who hanged Mark Devlin? This ruthless secret society held Dundee in a grip of terror in the 1830s. They were thought to be based in a cellar in Overgate, at that time a place of shadows and secrets. They used the cover of this medieval warren of properties to spark riots, launch break-ins and highway robberies. The Black Band fanned out across the booming city, and never struck in the same district twice. Dundee's new and tiny police force of 14 officers could not handle the gang's crime wave. But in February 1835 they got lucky. They caught Devlin, a young Irishman, carrying out a break-in. He was sentenced to hang at Dundee on May 30th. The magistrates had a problem though. The town had not had a hangman since the 1745 rebellion. The post had become so unpopular, because of the hanging of popular Jacobites, that no one would take it. So a young baillie arranged for an executioner to come from Edinburgh. The window frame was removed from the Guildhall within the townhouse, and a platform erected outside. The pulley was inside. The execution was timed for 2 p.m., but the Edinburgh hangman did not show. The race to find a replacement was always going to be hard. While the townspeople enjoyed the free entertainment of a public hanging, they also loved to hate the hangman. With just an hour to go, a volunteer was found who was willing to try his hand at execution. He demanded to wear a mask to conceal his identity. By 2 p.m., about 15,000 people packed the high street. When the hooded hangman came into sight, speculation rippled through the crowd. Then word went round like lightning, and within a minute, the throng knew the hangman's identity. He was James Livingston, a traveling fairground showman. As Devlin appeared, flanked by 2 priests, the hush of the crowd was broken by a woman's wailing. Devlin raised his cap, shook hands with the sheriff and magistrates, and made a penitent speech before being dispatched to eternity. Meanwhile, in Forfar, James Livingston was operating his merry-go-round, unaware of the character assassination going on in Dundee. But by evening he heard the first rumors, which grew over the coming days, threatening to destroy his name and business. In exasperation, he wrote to the Dundee Advertiser denying involvement, and citing as witnesses, Provost Mefan of Forfar and Town Officer John Stewart. The letter was countersigned by Mefan and the Forfar magistrates. This was enough to clear his reputation, but the true identity of the hooded hangman was never revealed. All that is known is he was a native of Dundee. The junior baillie who appointed him took the secret to his grave.
3. The Eppin murder. One of Scotland's most famous murder cases is still shrouded in mystery, despite attempts to crack it using modern forensic techniques. Experts who studied the available evidence relating to the 1752 Eppin murder concluded James Stewart, of the Glen, hanged for the crime, was not guilty, and the person identified as the main suspect was not responsible. However, no new suspects emerged for the shooting of Colin Campbell of Glenure, in the woods of Lettermore, near where the Balchheelish Bridge now stands. Experts invited to re-examine the case by the Royal Society of Edinburgh said, the evidence pointed to 2 unknown gunmen, not one, having killed Campbell. The murder was central to the plot of Robert Louis Stevenson's Kidnapped. In it, a man with a gun is seen running away up a hill. When David Balfour follows him, he finds his one-time traveling companion, Aileen Briac Stewart, armed only with a fishing rod. The expert group comprised of respected scientific, legal and academic figures, led by forensic anthropologist Professor Sue Black of Dundee University. She said, "We were looking at the evidence, and the fact as portrayed in the trial in Inverray. Everything else was hearsay or circumstantial." She said there was a re-examination of the medical, ballistics and identification evidence using modern techniques. This was presented by retired Judge Lord Cameron of Lochbroom, to more than 100 members of the public, who formed the jury. She added that the original indictment named Aileen Briac Stewart, Alan Breck in the book, as the guilty party for murder, and James Stewart as guilty of abetting him. She said that for Aileen Briac to have been guilty, evidence as to his whereabouts that day had to be examined. She said, the panel of experts agreed he could not have been the man on the hill. The look at the ballistic and medical evidence revealed the 2 shots, thought to have come from 1 musket, had come from 2. Ms. Black said, "We asked if there was any evidence Aileen Briac was responsible for pulling one of the triggers, and the answer was no. We asked if there was any evidence he was at the murder scene, and the answer was number." Lord Cameron put a proposition to the jury, that they must return a verdict on whether there is sufficient evidence to uphold the indictment that Aileen Briac Stewart was guilty of the murder. They were asked if they had heard evidence that supported the indictment, and not a single person put their hand up. If they didn't uphold the indictment, then there shouldn't have been a case against James Stewart. If Aileen Briac didn't commit the murder, how could James have abetted him? She said an eyewitness knew what Aileen Briac looked like, yet did not recognize him as the man on the hill. Evidence Colin Campbell was shot from behind was also questioned. Professor Dave Barclay, formerly of the Forensic Science Department at Robert Gordon University in Aberdeen, said the type of musket used could fire 2 shots, but it was unlikely as they would not have had the required power and accuracy.
4. Gilmerton Cove. Mystery is an overused word. So it comes as a surprise to find that a cottage on one of the main roads leading southeast, out of Edinburgh conceals a genuine mystery. The cottage in question stands in Gilmerton, today a suburb on the edge of Edinburgh, and 4 miles from the city centre. Gilmerton was originally a separate village which grew, from medieval origins to accommodate local coal miners, and limestone quarrymen and their families. This unassuming little cottage forms the entrance to Gilmerton Cove, a subterranean complex of passageways and chambers carved out of the sandstone bedrock on which this part of Gilmerton stands. The mystery arises because no one knows when this obviously man-made complex was excavated, or by whom, or what it was used for. Gilmerton Cove is a fascinating place to visit in its own right, and would remain so even if its history was clearly established. But it has to be said that the air of mystery that surrounds it makes a visit an even more compelling experience. As you'd expect, there are no shortage of theories seeking to explain the origins of Gilmerton Cove. The traditional theory is that the cove was the work of George Patterson, a blacksmith who is said to have excavated it between 1719 AD 1724 as a home and workshop for himself and his family. This theory first emerged in 1769, in verses written by the poet Alexander Pennacuick. It was given wider circulation in a detailed description of the cove, published in 1792 by the relevant Thomas White in the Transactions of the Society of the Antiquaries of Scotland. The Patterson theory held sway throughout the 1800s, helped by the discovery that on one occasion he had been charged by the Kirk with operating an illegal drinking den on the Sabbath. Meanwhile, the absence of any known grave for Patterson led some to suggest that he not only lived and worked in the cove, but was buried here too. In 1897, F.R. Coles, an assistant keeper of the National Museum of Antiquities of Scotland, undertook a comprehensive survey of Gilmerton Cove. His conclusions, published in the Scotsman newspaper in 1906, were that Gilmerton Cove was excavated long before George Patterson's day, largely because of the types of tools revealed by the marks on the rock. Coles thought the cove was very like other chambers in this traditional mining area excavated as trial bores, to see whether coal or other minerals might be found, and abandoned when they weren't. A comprehensive archaeological investigation of Gilmerton Cove took place between 2000 and 2002. Rubble blocking some of the chambers and passageways, but not others, was removed, and a set of stone steps providing a rear entrance was uncovered. Also uncovered were a network of drainage channels, and various artifacts from the last 3 centuries. The overall conclusion, however, was that Gilmerton Cove had been so regularly used, and reused over recent centuries, that meaningful archaeological evidence of its origins had been lost. A wander around Gilmerton Cove only serves to deepen the sense of mystery that surrounds it. Features originally named by White as a forge and a fireplace show no signs of burning on the surrounding rock. A glance at the blackening around any fireplace in any castle shows why this is so odd. Meanwhile, someone expended a considerable amount of work to dig out a well that does not go deep enough to find water, or is it simply intended as a drainage sump? And the form of the accommodation is curious. Many of the chambers seem to be furnished with carved bench seats facing inwards towards a carved table. You could get a large number of people down here, but all in small groups sitting facing one another over the carved tables in the individual chambers. Maybe the cove started life in the 1600s as a trial bore and Patterson simply used the abundant local mining expertise to expand it into an underground drinking den? On the other hand, the relative proximity to Rosslyn Chapel, 3½ miles to the south, has perhaps inevitably given rise to theories involving the Knights Templar, while others believe that the still-blocked tunnel, or tunnels heading north from the cove once covered the 1.5 to Craignillar Castle. Still others point at the name Cove, and ask whether this means it was once a centre for the black arts, the home of a coven during the era of Scotland's persecution of witches, or perhaps the name has an association with the National Covenant. The possible theories are endless, and that really is part of the fun.
5. The meaning of stones. Among the most popular types of art found across Scotland are ring and cup marks, which are patterns of concentric circles, and lines carved into rocks. Some of the art may be as old as 5,000 years. The meaning of these patterns is lost to time, if they ever had meaning at all. A linguistic mystery has arisen surrounding symbol-inscribed stones in Scotland, that predate the formation of the country itself. The stones are believed to have been carved by members of an ancient people known as the Picts, who thrived in what is now Scotland from the 4th to the 9th centuries. These symbols, researchers say, are probably words rather than images. but their conclusions have raised criticism from some linguists. The research team, led by Professor Rob Lee, from Exeter University in the UK, examined symbols on more than 200 carved stones. They used a mathematical method to quantify patterns contained within the symbols, in an effort to find out if they conveyed meaning. Professor Lee described the basis of this method. "If I told you the first letter of a word in English was Q and asked you to predict the next letter, you would probably say U and you would probably be right," he explained. "But if I told you the first letter was T, you would probably take many more guesses to get it right. That's a measure of uncertainty." Using the symbols, or characters, from the stones, Professor Lee and his colleagues measured this feature of so-called character-to-character uncertainty. They concluded that the Pictish carvings were symbolic markings that communicated information, that these were words rather than pictures. Professor Lee first published these conclusions in April of this year. But a recent article by French linguist Arnaud Fournet opened up the mystery once again. Mr. Fournet said that, by examining Pictish carvings as if they were linear symbols, and by applying the rules of written language to them, the scientists could have produced biased results. He told BBC News, "It looks like their method is transforming two-dimensional glyphs into a one-dimensional string of symbols. The carvings must have some kind of purpose, some kind of meanings, but it's very difficult to determine if their conclusion is contained in the raw data, or if it's an artifact of their method." Mr. Fournet also suggested that the researchers' methods should be tested, and verified for other ancient symbols. The line between writing and drawing is not as clear-cut as categorized in the paper, Mr. Fournet wrote in his article. On the whole, the conclusion remains pending. But Professor Lee says that his most recent analysis of the symbols, which has yet to be published, has reinforced his original conclusions. He also stressed he did not claim that the carvings were a full and detailed record of the Pictish language. "The symbols themselves are a very constrained vocabulary," he said. "But that doesn't mean that Pictish had such a constrained vocabulary." He said the carvings might convey the same sort of meaning as a list, perhaps of significant names, which would explain the limited number of words used. "It's like finding a menu for a restaurant, written in English, and that being your sole repository of the English language."
6. The disappearing Ninth Legion. The disappearance of Rome's Ninth Legion has long baffled historians, but could a brutal ambush have been the event that forged the England-Scotland border, asks archaeologist Dr. Miles Russell, of Bournemouth University. One of the most enduring legends of Roman Britain concerns the disappearance of the Ninth Legion. The theory that 5,000 of Rome's finest soldiers were lost in the swirling mists of Caledonia, as they marched north to put down a rebellion, forms the basis of a new film, The Eagle, but how much of it is true? It is easy to understand the appeal of stories surrounding the loss of the Roman Ninth Legion, a disadvantaged band of British warriors inflicting a humiliating defeat upon a well-trained, heavily armored professional army. It's the ultimate triumph of the underdog, an unlikely tale of victory against the odds. Recently, however, the story has seeped further into the national consciousness of both England and Scotland. For the English, the massacre of the Ninth is an inspiring tale of homegrown David successfully taking on a relentless European Goliath. For the Scots, given the debate on devolved government and national identity, not to say the cultural impact of Braveheart, the tale has gained extra currency, freedom-loving Highlanders resisting monolithic, London-based imperialists. The legend of the Ninth gained form thanks to acclaimed novelist, Rosemary Sutcliffe, whose masterpiece, The Eagle of the Ninth, became an instant bestseller when published in 1954. Since then, generations of children and adults have been entranced by the story of a young Roman officer, Marcus Aquila, traveling north of Hadrian's Wall in order to uncover the truth about his father, lost with the Ninth, and the whereabouts of the legion's battle standard, the Bronze Eagle. The historians have dissented, theorizing that the Ninth did not disappear in Britain at all, arguing both book and film are wrong. Their theory has been far more mundane. The legion was, in fact, a victim of strategic transfer, swapping the cold expanse of northern England for arid wastes in the Middle East. Here, sometime before AD 160, they were wiped out in a war against the Persians. But, contrary to this view, there is not one shred of evidence that the Ninth were ever taken out of Britain. It's just a guess which, over time, has taken on a sheen of cast iron certainty. 3 stamped tiles bearing the unit number of the ninth found at Nijmegen, in the Netherlands, have been used to support the idea of transfer from Britain. But these all seem to date to the 80s when detachments of the ninth were indeed on the Rhine fighting Germanic tribes. They do not prove that the ninth left Britain for good. In fact, the last certain piece of evidence relating to the existence of the legion from anywhere in the Roman Empire comes from York, where an inscription, dating to AD 108, credits the ninth with rebuilding the fortress in stone. Sometime between then and the mid-2nd century, when a record of all legions was compiled, the unit had ceased to exist. But what happened to the ninth? The early years of the 2nd century were deeply traumatic for Britannia. The Roman writer Fronto observed that, in the reign of the Emperor Hadrian, AD 117 to 138, large numbers of Roman soldiers were killed by the British. The number and full extent of these losses remain unknown, but they were evidently significant. The anonymously authored Augustan history, compiled in the 3rd century, provides further detail, noting that when Hadrian became emperor, the Britons could not be kept under Roman control. The British problem was of deep concern to Roman central government. Thanks to a tombstone recovered from Forentinum in Italy, we know that emergency reinforcements of over 3,000 men were rushed to the island on the British expedition, early in Hadrian's reign. The emperor himself visited the island in AD 122, in order to correct many faults, bringing with him a new legion, the 6th. The fact that they took up residence in the legionary fortress of York suggests that the great losses of personnel, alluded to by Fronto, had occurred within the ranks of the 9th. It would seem that Sutcliffe was right after all. It was the 9th, the most exposed and northerly of all legions in Britain, that had borne the brunt of the uprising, ending their days fighting insurgents in the turmoil of early 2nd century Britain. The loss of such an elite military unit had an unexpected twist, which reverberates to the present day. When the Emperor Hadrian visited Britain at the head of a major troop surge, he realized that there was only one way to ensure stability in the island: he needed to build a wall. Hadrian's wall was designed to keep invaders out of Roman territory, as well as ensuring that potential insurgents within the province had no hope of receiving support from their allies to the north. From this point, cultures on either side of the Great Divide developed at different rates, and in very different ways. The ultimate legacy of the 9th was the creation of a permanent border, forever dividing Britain. The origins of what were to become the independent kingdoms of England and Scotland may be traced to the loss of this unluckiest of Roman legions.
7. The missing Library of Iona. The island of Iona, off the west coast of Scotland, is the symbolic centre of Scottish Christianity. Through 1,400 years of history, its fortunes have fluctuated, from its heights as one of the greatest centers of learning in Dark Age Europe, to its lows as a crumbling ruin. However, thanks to the fame of its monastic founder, St. Columba, the island has always been revered as a holy place, and, over the centuries, Iona has continually been reinvented and reconstructed as a center for pilgrimage. Iona's fame began in 563 AD when Columba, with 13 followers, landed at the south end of the island, at St. Columba's Bay, to establish a monastery. The great abbey we see today belongs to a later era. Columba's Iona was very different. Columba had little interest in grand buildings. He was seeking seclusion among the desert of the Atlantic Ocean. Almost nothing remains of his original monastery, however traces of the vallum, or ditch, that surrounded the monastic enclosure, can still be seen. Inside would have been a settlement that resembled a small village, a modest, timber church, surrounded by huts for the monks to live and work in, and small cells to provide the solitude necessary for prayer. These cells, or chambers, used for prayer, are also found on the nearby islands of Canna and Islechnaim, and certain islands off the coast of Ireland such as Skellig Michael. From Adamnan, who wrote Columba's biography 100 years after his death, we know a great deal about the early monastery's daily life. Withdrawn, contemplative and austere, its primary purpose was the contemplation of God through prayer and learning. Holy texts from around Europe were copied, poetry flourished, and Adamnan himself wrote a guide to the Holy Land, a fact which illustrates that the monastery's intellectual horizons stretched right across Christendom. As a consequence, Iona amassed one of the greatest libraries in Western Europe, and became a powerhouse of Dark Age learning. Columba died on the 9th of June 597 AD. Adamnan writes that his final day was spent copying a psalter, on the Torah Alba, the hill of Scotland, the rock which stands in front of the abbey today. He urged his successor as abbot to take up his work, then went to the church, dying in prayer, before the altar with a final gesture of blessing on his monks. He is believed to have been buried below the small, stone chapel shrine, which is attached to the front of the abbey. It was around this building, or an earlier version of it, that the cult of Columba developed. Columba's monastery became a center of pilgrimage. At first, access was restricted to high-status pilgrims, royal and ecclesiastical visitors, or those in serious trouble, who stayed at its guest house, but later more humble pilgrims would have been allowed access to the monastery. The pilgrims traveled to Iona in life and in death. Many of the kings of Scotland, Ireland, and even of the Vikings, were buried there. Some of the most famous kings of Alba, from Kenneth MacAlpin to Macbeth, made their final journey there, across the Sound to Iona, onto the harbour, and up the Street of the Dead to the burial ground, the Religioron. This royal tradition was only broken twice whilst the Western Isles stayed a part of the Kingdom of Alba, once by Constantine Mac, buried St Andrews, and again by Malcolm Canmore, buried at Dunfermline. The last king to be interred on Iona was Malcolm's brother, Donald Bane, before Malcolm's son, Edgar, surrendered the island to Magnus, King of Norway, after he subdued the Isles to his will in 1098 AD. Recently the tradition was revived, and Iona was again the center of national mourning, when the Labour leader, John Smith, was buried there. Wealthy pilgrims brought money to the monastery, and in the 8th century some of the finest Dark Age works of art were created to glorify Columba. The Book of Kells, now held in Trinity College Dublin, was crafted on Iona, along with the Celtic high crosses from the 8th and 9th centuries, dedicated to St. Martin, St. Odrain, St. John and St. Matthew. The crosses are of exquisite Celtic design and were given by wealthy patrons, to promote the cult of Columba. In 794 AD, Iona experienced the first of many Viking raids, that eventually forced the monastery into decline. As one historian has commented, rich monasteries like Iona were the Dark Age equivalent of drive-in banks to the Vikings. In 806 AD, a total of 68 monks were slain by the Vikings at Martyrs Bay, just south of the ferry landing. By 825 AD the monastery, thanks to its exposed position, was virtually abandoned. Street Blathmac refused to leave, and suffered martyrdom at the hands of Vikings for refusing to divulge the treasures and relics of Columba. In 849 AD Columba's relics were removed, and divided two ways between Scotland and Ireland. Iona may have been abandoned, but in the 10th century its power was revived, after the Vikings converted to Christianity, and intermarried with the local Gaelic populace. New building works began, such as Street Oran's Chapel, beside the Road of the Dead, and Margaret, Queen of Alba, made donations to promote the cult of Columba. In 1200 AD, Ragnall, son of Sumerd, virtual king of the Isles, brought in the Benedictine order and built the Great Abbey. He also established Street Ronan's Nunnery, named after one of Iona's monks, which accommodated up to 400 Augustinian nuns. The ruins of this building still stand within the village. Ragnall's sister, Bethg, was instated as Street Ronan's first prioress. The importation of reformed monastic orders, like the Benedictines, to the heart of Columban monasticism wasn't without controversy. The Bishop of Derry attacked the building works, but Ragnall prevailed and the abbey was completed. The Benedictines revitalized the Columban cult on Iona, until the Reformation, when the abbey was abandoned and slowly fell into ruin. For just under 400 years the settlement lay in ruins until, in 1938, the Iona Community, an ecumenical Christian group, was founded there by the Reverend George MacLeod. Committed to finding the relevance of the gospel, they set about restoring the ruined abbey.
8. The fate of David Stewart. The hunt is on to find the body of an heir to the Scottish throne, who is believed to have been murdered, and dumped in an unmarked grave more than 6 centuries ago. David Stewart was the first Duke of Rothesay, the same title now used by Prince Charles, when he is in Scotland. The tragic Duke was just 24 when he was arrested by his ambitious uncle, imprisoned and, it is widely suspected, murdered. The body was buried in an unmarked grave 1402, somewhere in the grounds of Lindores Abbey, Fife, and has lain there for the past 611 years. Now a team of historians and archaeologists plans to pinpoint the grave, exhume the body, and settle once and for all the mystery of how Prince Charles' predecessor met his end. David Stuart, the son of nailing King Robert III, became Duke of Rothesay in 1398, and the following year Lieutenant of the Kingdom. That put him in conflict with his uncle, Robert, the first Duke of Albany, who had enjoyed the status of protector up to that point. David was arrested by his uncle in 1401 and imprisoned at Falkland Palace, Fife. The cause of his death the following year remains one of the most enduring mysteries of Scottish history. Legend has it he was allowed to starve to death in the dungeon. Now the modern-day custodians of Lindores Abbey want to locate the Duke's grave so that the mystery of his death hopefully be solved, and his remains properly buried. The Edinburgh Archaeological Field Society has revealed it plans to assist in the search by using special electronic gear to scan the grounds for human remains. Andrew Mackenzie Smith, whose family have owned the abbey for 100 years, revealed, "We've been trying to put together a team to apply for funding to do a dig. The nice thing would be to find out how he was killed. They could do that with DNA, or they will know if someone starved to death as opposed to being poisoned. After that he could be buried properly, even if it was here at Lindores." Referring to the celebrated king in the car park case, he added, "If they find him it's as big a story if not bigger than Richard III, the Duke of Albany claimed his nephew's death was caused by dysentery, and the result of divine providence and not otherwise." The more lurid tales of the time, however, suggest the dying Duke of Rothesay ate his own hands in a desperate bid to stay alive. Whatever the truth, his death allowed the Duke of Albany to rule Scotland, as regent for many years. Steve Boardman, head of Edinburgh University's Medieval History section, said a find could shed new light on the Duke. He said one tradition believed that had the Duke of Rothesay lived, he would have proved personally dissolute and unreliable. He added, "There's a contradictory tradition that emphasizes he was a young, active prince who would have excelled as King David III." Lindores Abbey would later become famous as the birthplace of whiskey, with King James IV commissioning a large quantity of aquavitae from a monk at the abbey in 1494. But the abbey was attacked in 1543 by a mob of John Knox's supporters during the upheaval of the Reformation, and later fell into ruin. It was announced this week Lindores Abbey would once again distill whiskey.
9. The Great Mull Plain Mystery. A chance discovery by Royal Navy warships may prove to be the key that can unravel a 29-year-old mystery involving a veteran wartime pilot who was found dead, but uninjured, 4 months after his aircraft went missing. The story of the pilot, whose body was discovered on a remote Scottish island hillside in April 1976, has fascinated aviation experts and conspiracy theorists for nearly 3 decades. How did he become separated from his aircraft? Why was his body not located by the search teams that scoured Mull in the immediate aftermath of his disappearance? Was he really at the wheel of the tiny Cessna Inn, which eyewitnesses insist he took off on Christmas Eve 1975? In the course of a coastal mapping operation early this month, the minesweepers HMS Pembroke, HMS Penzance and HMS Inverness located a mystery aircraft 30 meters beneath the surface in the waters off Oban, on the west coast of Scotland. Pembroke deployed a remote underwater camera to take pictures of the wreckage. The images show a small aircraft, with one wing still attached. Speculation is growing that the plane may be the Cessna. The plane that went missing that night was a red and white Cessna F-150H, registration mark GAVTN. In September 1975 it was purchased by Ian Hamilton, who kept it at the North Connell Airport near Oban. But Hamilton was not the pilot when GAVTN went missing on Wednesday, December 24, 1975. At the controls was a 55-year-old businessman from London, Norman Peter Gibbs, who had learned to fly as a serviceman during the Second World War. Gibbs's body was found, in April 1975, on Mull by a local shepherd, Donald McKinnon. It was lying on a hillside about a mile from the tiny grass airstrip from which Gibbs had taken off. No wreckage was found to indicate the fate of the aircraft. The facts, assembled in the book Scottish Mysteries by Donald M. Fraser, are undisputed. Gibbs arrived on Mull on Saturday 20 December along with his girlfriend, Felicity Granger, a 32-year-old university lecturer. Gibbs, the managing director of a property development company called Gibbs & Ray, was looking for investment opportunities. He was interested in buying a hotel. Gibbs found out that a Cessna aircraft was available to hire from the manager of the Glenfersa Hotel. He had a private pilot's license and about 2,000 hours of flying experience. On Christmas Eve, Gibbs and Granger flew the plane from Mull to Broadford on the Isle of Skye, and spent the day inspecting property. They flew back to Mull in time for dinner. Having eaten and enjoyed modest quantities of whiskey and red wine, Gibbs outlined his theory that it might be possible to make night landings at Glenfersa, although the little airstrip was not equipped with runway lights. Gibbs believed an airlink would be precious in making a luxury hotel development profitable. He decided to take the Cessna up and land it in the dark. If Gibbs had not been such a confident and ostensibly experienced pilot, others might have told him that what he was planning was illegal as well as dangerous. But he seemed sublimely confident. He had borrowed 2 powerful torches to use as makeshift landing lights. Felicity would remain on the ground and use them to guide him in. The couple arrived at the airstrip at about 9:30 p.m. Gibbs taxied the Cessna to the eastern end of the runway. Here, Granger got out and followed her boyfriend's instructions to place the 2 torches, about a foot apart facing the aircraft. He seemed content that, in the clear sky, the torch beams would give him an adequate reference point at which to aim. Gibbs roared into the sky. He had told Granger that he would land once, just to prove that it was straightforward, and then return. The Cessna failed to return. At 10 p.m. she returned to the hotel. 2 hours after Gibbs had taken off, the police were called in. The weather had deteriorated dramatically, but, in freezing rain and snow, Mull's tiny police force did their best to cover the flight path along which they believed the Cessna had flown. They found nothing. Nor did the RAF and Naval Air Service helicopters which, on Christmas Day, began scouring the island and deployed sonar equipment to look for wreckage. The search continued for days, using hundreds of volunteers. Neither Peter Gibbs nor his aircraft were located. Pilot and Cessna seemed to have disappeared without trace. When, 4 months later, Donald McGinnon stumbled across Gibbs's body, the circumstances were ideal for the emergence of conspiracy theories. Why had the body not been located by the searchers? Why was there no trace of the aircraft in which Gibbs had taken off? Had it really been Gibbs at the controls that night? Speculation also mounted about the presence of a mystery character on the runway before Gibbs took off. Had Gibbs planned his disappearance to escape business debts? The fatal accident inquiry into Gibbs's death did little to quell the tide of rumors. Gibbs's body was uninjured, apart from a small abrasion on the left leg. It did not look like the corpse of a man who had crashed an aircraft into a hillside. Had he crashed at sea, and somehow struggled ashore and died there of exposure? Neither Gibbs's body nor his clothes revealed evidence that they had been immersed in salt water. But the inquiry considered it likely that 4 months of rain, wind and snow might have washed sea salt away. The finding of the inquiry was that Gibbs had died of exposure, not as a result of injuries consistent with an air crash. He had, somehow, become separated from the Cessna. As the Procurator Fiscal Graham Pagan concluded, this inquiry has taken some mystery out, but until the plane is found, then the mystery will remain. In September 1986, 2 clam fishermen from Mull were diving in the Sound of Mull, when they reported coming across a red and white aircraft on the seabed. From what they were able to see, they did not detect any human remains in the plane. The divers, who were brothers called Richard and John Grieve, confirmed that the plane they saw was a Cessna, and that it did bear the registration GAVTN. Their report was considered credible. It seemed that Gibbs, lost in the dark, had descended low over the sea, while desperately trying to locate the airstrip. Somehow, fully clothed and in near-freezing conditions, he had managed to swim more than half a kilometer to the shore, and had then climbed the hillside, only to die of exposure. It is the most likely answer. But the wreckage found by the Grieve brothers was never recovered. And the pictures taken were not good enough to allow expert air accident inspectors to assess whether the crash had been survivable. The plane that the brothers found appeared to be seriously damaged. The engine had been detached from the airframe, and was lying some distance from it. One of the wheels appeared to have been torn off. They reported that both wings were missing. The aircraft cited by the Royal Navy appears to be in the same spot. But there are discrepancies. Navy divers and the film taken by HMS Pembroke suggest that one wing is still firmly attached to the fuselage. A Royal Navy spokesman, Neil Smith, said, "We think it could be a Cessna, but we have not confirmed that yet. A possibility exists that this is not Peter Gibbs's plane at all. A 6-seater Piper Aztec is known to have ditched in the area 20 years ago. Its crew escaped unharmed. If what the Navy has found is Cessna GAVTN, then it may only be a matter of time before the mystery of Peter Gibbs's last flight is finally unraveled."
10. The Glasgow Effect. With a referendum on Scottish independence now agreed, Scottish nationalists can dare to wonder, what would an independent Scotland look like? Alex Salmond naturally has plenty of suggestions. Two adjectives he is unlikely to choose are unhealthy and short-lived, but, as delegates at Scotland's annual Public Health Conference will hear this week, the poor health of Scotland's citizens remains a matter of profound concern. With the lowest life expectancy in Western Europe, Scotland has been in the grip of a public health crisis for decades now. And ground zero for that crisis is unquestionably the country's largest city, Glasgow. Whether it is deaths from cirrhosis, drug abuse, lung cancer, murder or suicide, Glasgow's mortality rates are easily the highest in Britain, and among the highest in Europe. Life expectancy at birth in Glasgow is the lowest in the UK, more than 6 years below the national average for Glaswegian men, 71.6 years, compared with a UK average of 78.2 years, and more than 4 years below average for Glasgow's women, 78 years, compared with the UK average of 82.3. And because Glasgow is home to more than 10% of Scotland's total population, with nearly 600,000 people in the city itself, and more than 1 million in the Greater Glasgow area, Glasgow's problems are very much Scotland's problems. It's a human tragedy on a massive scale, says Jerry McCartney, an epidemiologist at NHS Scotland. His colleague, David Walsh, a lead researcher at Glasgow Centre for Population Health adds, "You are talking about thousands of people dying before their time." Stand in the bustling centre of Buchanan Street on a sunny autumn afternoon, and you would be hard-pressed to spot signs of a public health emergency in Glasgow. Shoppers stream past the pristine sandstone shopfronts, looking every bit as prosperous and confident as Salmond could wish for, and no less healthy than people anywhere else in Britain. Walk a few miles east, however, and the dire statistics become easier to believe. Glasgow city boundaries contain some of Britain's most deprived neighbourhoods. You don't need to be a doctor to see how unhealthy people in these communities are, says Dr. Sakit Priyadarshi, a senior GP in Glasgow's addiction services, who has spent most of his professional life treating addicts in the city's East End. He is not exaggerating. Pale men cluster outside windowless pubs puffing on cigarettes. A frail couple, 3 crutches between them, totter out of an off-license, pausing to adjust the large plastic cider bottles in their backpacks. An obese man with a withered leg limps down Tollcross Road, eating pizza from a cardboard box. Yet, the conventional wisdom that Glasgow's ill health is all down to poverty, bad diet and bad behavior is, at best, partial and, at worst, misleading. Despite years of research and decades of evidence that something has gone terribly wrong in the heart of Scotland's largest city, the underlying causes of Glasgow's fatally poor health remain something of a scientific mystery. Poverty alone doesn't account for Glasgow's dismally low life expectancy. Other British cities, Liverpool and Manchester, for example, have rates of deprivation every bit as high as Glasgow, yet their life expectancies are substantially higher. What's more, even Glasgow's most affluent citizens, those in the top 10% of the income distribution, die significantly younger than their counterparts in other British cities. At best, according to the epidemiologist's calculations, deprivation accounts for less than half, around 40%, of Glasgow's mortality gap compared with the rest of the UK. The other causes are still unknown. Epidemiologists call it the Glasgow effect, which sounds reassuringly scientific, but, as Walsh readily concedes, It is nothing more than a label scientists have chosen for their ignorance. The use of that word, effect, excites people, he laments. They start saying because of the Glasgow effect. As though we know what it is. The whole point is, it's something we don't know the answer to. With colleagues at NHS Scotland and the University of Glasgow, Walsh has devoted much of the past 5 years to uncovering what makes Glasgow so different, compared with other, similarly deprived British cities. If you think deep-fried Mars bars are to blame for Glasgow's ill health, as many English commentators seem to, then think again. Obesity rates in the city are actually lower than in some English cities. Nor can Glasgow's infamous penchant for alcohol and cigarettes explain the puzzle. According to the largest health surveys in England and Scotland, Glaswegians neither binge drink nor smoke more than their peers in Liverpool or Manchester. Drug abuse, particularly heroin, knife crime, murder and suicide are all significantly more prevalent in Glasgow than in other cities. But that only prompts the question, why is this the case? What is it about life in Glasgow that seems to predispose some of its citizens to such destructive behaviors? Lots of people have their own pet hypotheses about it, Walsh says. In a recent research paper, Walsh, McCartney and their co-authors, Chick Collins and David Batty, assessed no fewer than 17 competing explanations for Glasgow's ill health. There are theories that blame the weather, perhaps it is vitamin D deficiency or chilly winters? Those that blame the data, perhaps Glasgow is simply poorer than it looks? Plenty of theories that blame the Glaswegians, a culture of hedonism, sectarianism or alienation, and still others that point the finger at the Tories, a political attack on Glasgow, conducted by Margaret Thatcher's government. Some have more supporting evidence than others, but all are unproven, says Walsh. The main thing to say is that it's not going to be one thing. It's going to be a combination of different factors interacting, he says. This leaves Scotland's policymakers in something of a quandary. How can you tackle a problem when you don't know what is causing it? The answer so far has been to bring an increasingly heavy regulation of unhealthy choices. In recent years, Scotland has become a trailblazer for public health regulations. The country was the first in Britain to ban smoking in public places, and hopes to become the first to introduce a minimum unit price for alcohol. These policies are wholeheartedly welcomed by Dr. Linda de Sestecker, Director of Public Health for NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde. She has pressed for restrictions on the opening of new bars and off-licenses, and on the serving of unhealthy food in schools and public buildings, and is pondering whether councils might restrict the opening of fast food restaurants near Glasgow's schools. I get accused of being sort of regulation for everything, de Sestecker notes, dryly. But at the very least we need to make the healthy choices cheaper than the unhealthy choices. Scotland's approach to tackling deaths from violent crime has been rather more creative. A decade ago, Glasgow languished as the murder capital of Western Europe, with rates of knife crime and homicide more than double those in London, but its homicide rate has fallen by a third since the early 2000s, and violent crime is also decreasing. The city's Innovative Violence Reduction Unit, VRU, established by Strathclyde Police in 2005, can claim a large share of the credit, having piloted a range of unorthodox strategies to cut violent crime. These include giving police officers full-time posts on school campuses, bringing violent gangs into court en masse to confront the communities they terrorize, and training dentists and vets to recognize the signs of domestic abuse. We took the attitude that it's so big and so complex, it doesn't make any difference where you start, says VRU co-director, Detective Chief Superintendent John Carnocan, candidly. Just make a bloody start. All of which makes Glasgow's dismal life expectancy all the more demoralizing. If Scotland is to fulfill its potential, whether independently or as part of the UK, then Glasgow needs to heal. But, for now, social scientists continue to juggle dozens of different research projects, all aimed at uncovering the causes of the city's malaise. Scotland's policymakers can only hope they succeed, and the sooner the better.